All right, we're Nathan, Ben, and Lars, and our topic was Lincoln as emancipator. And the research question that we came up with was, to what extent was Lincoln truly the great emancipator that he is viewed as? And our central claim that we based all our research off of was that Lincoln was primarily focused on preserving the Union, and his emancipation of the slaves was a byproduct of him trying to put pressure on the South.
So before the war broke out between the North and the South, conflict was seen as inevitable due to the necessary destruction of the Confederacy in order to preserve the Union. The doctrine of military necessity was a common slogan used by both civilians and soldiers alike due to the presence of the controversial topic of emancipation with Congress, the media, and universities. Lincoln began his approach to the end of slavery with the proposition of the initiation of emancipation in the spring of 1862, which was promptly rejected by the border states. Lincoln's stance on emancipation was evident beginning in the fall of 1862 when he gave his entreaties to the border states of Delaware, Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky, where he stated that he wanted to find the least violent and revolutionary way to end slavery as possible with compensated emancipation plans. Following his unpopular proposition of the initiation of emancipation, he pronounced the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in order to warn the Confederacy that if they continued their rebellion, their slaves would be freed on January 1st, 1863. This act only increased the South's resentment of Lincoln, which led to Lincoln keeping his word and signing the final proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Due to Lincoln's gradually increasing efforts to begin the emancipation of the slaves while continually being attacked by the South, his resentment of slavery and his steps toward abolition proved his position against emancipation is constant.
So even though Lincoln's primary goal throughout the war wasn't necessarily to emancipate all the slaves, Lincoln actually did a lot throughout the war to improve the welfare status of African Americans. His main objective throughout the war, like I stated before, was to preserve the Union, but many positive developments for African Americans occurred as a byproduct of Lincoln's attempts to put pressure on the South. For example, in his 1862 presidential proclamation, Lincoln states that no officers in the United States Armed Forces are allowed to return slaves to their owners, as well as setting slaves of persons in rebellion against the United States free. Although these words did help slaves in some sense, the latter statement didn't effectively do much, as it only set slaves in the South free, and the South didn't even recognize Lincoln as their president. However, if these slaves managed to escape to the North, Lincoln's proclamation made it illegal to return these slaves to their owners in the South or impede their liberties. Lincoln also tried to create sympathy to the abolitionist movement from Northern slave owners by promising compensation for loss of slaves during emancipation. These words, paired with Lincoln's insistence that African Americans serve in the war, really helped to create sympathy towards the abolitionist movement and therefore improve the social standing of African Americans in the Union. Lincoln faced a lot of opposition for his efforts. Lincoln was criticized from several different directions and for multiple different reasons. The most prominent and most obvious of these criticisms was from the South. The South resented Lincoln and the Union because of the movement to abolish slavery, as well as the fact that they were at war with the North. Lincoln responded to this opposition by continuing to put pressure on the South by weakening the institution of slavery, mainly through his efforts to make slavery illegal altogether. The South might have been Lincoln's largest and most evident critic, but Lincoln also faced opposition in the North. Many people thought that Lincoln wasn't doing enough to combat slavery, and they felt that he should be more aggressive in targeting the institution. This point of view is evidenced by New York Times Tribune editor Horace Greeley's criticisms of Lincoln in 1862. Greeley was mad that Lincoln wasn't doing enough to enforce the Second Confiscation Act and voiced his opinion in a letter to Lincoln. Lincoln calmly responded to this letter with a letter of his own. Through the use of very eloquent and persuasive wording, Lincoln basically states that his main objective in the war is to preserve the Union, not emancipate all the slaves. He clearly states that if emancipation were a byproduct of preserving the Union, it would be an ideal situation. However, he makes it very clear that he will do everything in his power to preserve the Union. As the war progresses, Lincoln realizes that he can use emancipation to weaken the South, and he becomes more aggressive in that regard. As a result, the opposition within the North quells.
Even though Lincoln had opposition from the North, he also had support from the African American community. Prior to the Civil War, Lincoln personally viewed slavery as morally wrong and against the rights of African Americans as human beings. Even though he believed this, he didn't take his personal views into office with him when he won the presidential term. Although Lincoln viewed slavery as wrong, he still didn't believe that African Americans should have the same rights as whites. Despite this, members of the black community viewed Lincoln as quite positive and honest. Frederick Douglass recalls his first meeting with Lincoln. "I at once felt myself in the presence of an honest man, on whom I could love, honor, and trust without reserve or doubt," and claiming that he felt history itself had taken the right turn with President Lincoln in charge. Other African American advocates for abolition also had positive views of Lincoln. Harriet Tubman initially held a negative view of Lincoln, until fellow abolitionist Sojourner Truth convinced her that he was a friend of the African American community. "I'm sorry now. I didn't like Lincoln in them days, and you see, we colored people didn't understand that he was our friend," Tubman stated, later thanking Lincoln for freeing the slaves and issuing the Emancipation Proclamation.
Overall, Lincoln did some good things through his effort to put pressure on the South, and he actually ended up emancipating the slaves because the North won the war. But as we've stated several times, that wasn't his primary objective, so he shouldn't be viewed as this hero that set out to emancipate slavery. He was a very good president, but emancipation wasn't his primary goal in office. This has been History Facts with Nathan, Ben, and Lars. Let's get it.
Built my legs, driving business, not no Lexus. She on